In many religions, you can sin, you can fail, you can fall, and you'll still be forgiven. But doubt? Doubt is treated like poison. Ask the wrong question, and suddenly you're dangerous. Not immoral, unstable. Not lost, a threat. Why is questioning God often worse than breaking God's rules? Tonight, we're not attacking faith. We're dissecting fear. Because once you understand why doubt terrifies religious systems more than sin, you'll never hear sermons or silence the same way again. And it gets uncomfortable fast. Sin can be fixed. Doubt can't. Here is the first contradiction most people never notice. Sin is expected. It is assumed. In fact, it is planned for. Religious systems are not shocked by failure because failure is part of the design. You are told you will fall short. You are told you will struggle. And conveniently, you are also told exactly where to go when you do. Confession exists for a reason. Repentance exists for a reason. Redemption is always waiting, right on schedule. Sin fits neatly into the narrative because it reinforces it. You break the rule. You feel guilt. You return to the authority that defined the rule in the first place. The system remains intact, maybe even stronger than before. Sin keeps you close. It keeps you dependent. It reminds you that you need guidance, structure, and permission to feel whole again. In a strange way, sin is reassuring. It confirms that the map is correct and that the destination still exists. You just took a wrong turn. Doubt does something entirely different. Doubt does not come crawling back. It does not apologize. It does not ask to be cleansed. Doubt pauses and looks around. It asks why the rule exists at all. It asks who decided this path was the only one. It asks questions that have no official checkpoint for return. And that is where the danger begins. Because answers are not neutral. Answers redistribute power. The moment you stop asking how to be forgiven and start asking how belief itself was constructed, the hierarchy shifts. You are no longer just a participant. You become an observer. Sin keeps you inside the system, emotionally and psychologically. Doubt creates distance. It makes you step back far enough to see the frame around the picture. And once you see the frame, you cannot unsee it. That single question changes everything. Who built this system in the first place? Who benefits from it continuing exactly as it is? Who loses authority the moment that question is taken seriously? Sin says something is wrong with me. Doubt quietly asks, what if something is wrong with the story I was given? One leads you back to the altar. The other leads you into uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one place a rigid belief system cannot control you. Sin confirms authority. Doubt challenges it. Think about what actually happens after sin. Not the theology, but the behavior. When someone believes they have sinned, their instinct is not independence, it is submission. They move toward authority, not away from it. They look for guidance. They seek absolution. They want permission to feel clean again, forgiven again, acceptable again. Sin places the individual below the system. It reinforces the idea that someone else knows better. Someone else has the answers. Someone else has the right to judge what is broken and what is restored. Authority becomes necessary, even comforting, because without it, the guilt has nowhere to go. That is why sin stabilizes hierarchies. It validates the role of priests, pastors, elders, texts, and traditions. It confirms that the chain of command is real and required. The moment you feel morally compromised, you are far less likely to challenge the voice offering you relief. Doubt does not behave that way. When doubt enters, you do not kneel, you slow down, you observe, you begin to analyze instead of confess, you compare one claim against another. You notice patterns, contradictions, and convenient explanations that once felt invisible. Most importantly, you stop assuming that the person speaking has more access to truth than you do. That is a quiet revolution. Because doubt does not just ask whether God exists. It asks why this person speaks with such certainty. It asks how authority was assigned, preserved, and protected. It asks why some questions are encouraged while others are labeled dangerous. In that moment, authority is no longer sacred. It becomes human, fallible, historically shaped, politically useful. Institutions are not deeply afraid of immorality. Immorality can be managed, corrected, disciplined, absorbed back into the structure. What they fear is the loss of narrative control. The moment people stop accepting explanations at face value, the story begins to fracture. And once the story fractures, obedience is no longer automatic. But this is only the surface layer. Beneath it lies a deeper psychological threat that makes doubt far more unsettling than any act of disobedience. Doubt is contagious. Sin is personal. It happens in private spaces, inside thoughts and behaviors that can be hidden, managed, or quietly confessed. You can isolate it. You can lower your voice. You can speak to one trusted authority figure and keep everything contained. The damage, if there is any, stays localized. That is why sin is manageable. It does not threaten the group. It does not ripple outward. A person can be labeled as weak, forgiven, corrected, and reintegrated without anyone else needing to re-examine their own beliefs. Doubt works the opposite way. Doubt refuses to stay quiet, not because it is loud, but because it is honest. It leaks out in casual moments, in a question asked without malice, in a pause where certainty used to be, in a sentence that begins with, "I am not sure anymore." And that is all it takes. One honest question, overheard by the wrong person, can destabilize years of rehearsed certainty. One conversation after a service, said without anger or agenda, can linger longer than an entire sermon. One admission of uncertainty can feel like permission others did not know they were waiting for. Because many people are not convinced, they are compliant. They are repeating answers they inherited, not conclusions they reached. When someone voices doubt out loud, it breaks the illusion that belief is unanimous. That is why doubt is framed as rebellion, as temptation, as spiritual weakness. Those labels are not about truth. They are about containment. They turn curiosity into something shameful and dangerous, so it can be suppressed before it spreads. But once people realize they are allowed to question, something irreversible happens. The internal censor relaxes. The forbidden thought loses its power. The mind starts moving again. And that is when the spell breaks. Belief systems rely on the assumption that everyone else believes more than they do. Doubt exposes that assumption as fragile. And systems built on fragile assumptions do not survive once people start thinking out loud. Doubt exposes the fear beneath faith. Here is the darker truth most people never say out loud. Many believers are not afraid that doubt is wrong. They are afraid it might be right. Not provably right, not logically perfect, but right enough to destabilize everything they built their life on. Doubt opens a door they were trained to avoid. Not slammed shut, not locked, just quietly labeled as forbidden. Do not go there. Do not think about that. Do not follow that thought to its conclusion. Because on the other side of that door is uncertainty, and uncertainty has no comforting script. Behind that door is meaning without guarantees, no promise that everything happens for a reason, no assurance that suffering is being recorded, balanced, or rewarded later. Just life, happening without supervision. And that is terrifying to someone who was taught that morality only exists because it is watched. Doubt also introduces a more unsettling idea. What if goodness does not need surveillance? What if kindness, honesty, and responsibility are choices rather than commands? What if morality still exists even when no one is keeping score? For many believers, that thought feels like standing on air. Once you walk through that door, there is no clean path back to comfortable certainty. You can still appreciate stories, traditions, and rituals, but they no longer carry the same weight. The answers that once felt solid now feel inherited. The certainty that once felt safe begins to feel rehearsed. And that loss is not intellectual, it is emotional. People do not cling to belief systems only because they are convinced. They cling because those systems organize fear. They explain death. They justify suffering. They offer cosmic reassurance when reality feels indifferent. Doubt threatens all of that at once. So, doubt must be framed as evil, not because it corrupts morality, but because it removes the emotional scaffolding that holds fear in place. Once doubt is allowed, people must sit with unanswered questions, with ambiguity, with responsibility, and that responsibility is heavier than any rule book. It means your choices matter even when no one is watching. It means meaning is something you create, not something assigned. It means there is no authority to blame when life feels unfair. That is why doubt feels dangerous. It strips away protective answers and leaves you face to face with yourself. For someone who built their entire identity on certainty, on having the answers, on knowing where they stand in the universe, that is not just uncomfortable, it is an existential threat. Sin still believes the story. This part is subtle, but it changes everything once you see it. When someone sins, they are still participating in the story. They may feel guilt, shame, or regret, but underneath all of that is belief. They believe the rules matter. They believe the moral framework is valid. They believe they crossed a real line, even if they did it knowingly. Sin is not rebellion against the system itself. It is failure inside the system. It accepts the authority of the rules while admitting personal weakness. That is why sin often comes with self-blame rather than system-level questioning. The conclusion is simple. Something is wrong with me. Doubt does not reach that conclusion. Doubt pauses before accepting the story at all. It asks where the rules came from. It asks why this behavior is condemned while another is praised. It asks why one culture calls something sacred and another calls it irrelevant. It asks who decided this was a sin in the first place. Those questions are destabilizing because they shift the focus. The spotlight moves away from the individual and onto the structure itself. Instead of internalizing guilt, doubt externalizes scrutiny. Why this rule and not another? Why this interpretation and not its opposite? Why is obedience rewarded and curiosity punished? Why does belief feel less like discovery and more like inheritance? And then comes the most uncomfortable question of all. Who benefits from me believing this? Sin never asks that. Sin says, I am broken, I failed, I need correction. It keeps the story intact and places the problem safely inside the individual. The system remains unquestioned, untouchable, and justified. Doubt flips that dynamic. Doubt quietly suggests that maybe the system itself deserves examination. Maybe the framework is not as timeless as it claims. Maybe the rules evolved for social control, stability, or survival, rather than divine command. And systems do not forgive that easily. They can forgive weakness. They can forgive disobedience. They can forgive failure. What they struggle to forgive is scrutiny. Once a system is examined instead of obeyed, it loses its automatic authority. Because a rule only has power when it is believed to be unquestionable. The moment people start asking why, the story begins to loosen. And a loosened story cannot hold people the same way again. Childhood conditioning and the fear of thinking. From a very young age, many believers absorb a lesson that is never formally taught, but constantly reinforced. Obedience is safety. Questions are risk. You learn it not through arguments, but through reactions, through tone, through what is praised and what is quietly discouraged. A child who accepts answers is called respectful. A child who asks too many questions is corrected. Not harshly at first, just enough to signal where the invisible lines are. Some questions make adults uncomfortable. Some thoughts do not belong here, and the child learns to adjust. As years pass, the message becomes clearer. Teenagers who doubt are not met with curiosity. They are met with warnings. Be careful. Do not go down that path. Do not let those thoughts take root. Doubt is no longer treated as a phase of growth, but as a threat that must be managed before it spreads. By adulthood, the pattern is set. Those who question openly are rarely confronted directly. They are distanced. Conversations become shorter. Invitations fade. Concern replaces dialogue. Not because they are cruel people, but because the system has trained them to protect itself emotionally. At the center of this conditioning is an unspoken contract. If you trust us, you will be okay. If you follow these rules, life will make sense. If you believe what we believe, you will belong. Breaking that contract does not feel like disagreement. It feels like betrayal. When someone doubts, it triggers fear in others. Not just fear that the belief might be wrong, but fear that the promise might be fragile. If questioning is allowed, then safety was never guaranteed. And that realization is destabilizing. So doubt is reframed. It is no longer curiosity. It becomes disloyalty. a lack of faith, a moral failing disguised as intellectual pride. The goal is not to answer the question, but to stop the questioning itself. Because in closed systems, loyalty matters more than truth. Unity matters more than accuracy. Stability matters more than understanding. Thinking freely is risky, not because it leads to chaos, but because it exposes how much of the structure depends on unexamined trust. And once people realize they were trained to fear their own thoughts, the control loses its quiet power. What happens when doubt is allowed? Here is the irony most critics never acknowledge. Doubt does not destroy meaning, it refines it. It strips away what was inherited, rehearsed, and unexamined, and leaves behind what can actually withstand scrutiny. What remains is often quieter, but far more solid. People who move through doubt instead of running from it tend to change in unexpected ways. They often become calmer, not more chaotic, less reactive, less afraid of being wrong. When certainty collapses, something softer takes its place. Humility, curiosity, a willingness to say, "I do not know," without panic. Their ethics change too. They stop behaving morally because they are watched, judged, or threatened. They stop imagining an invisible scoreboard, tracking every thought and action. Instead, morality becomes internal, chosen, personal. They ask not, "What am I allowed to do?" but "What kind of person do I want to be?" That shift is profound. A person who chooses morality without surveillance is often more consistent than someone who obeys out of fear. Compassion stops being a rule and becomes a response. Honesty stops being an obligation and becomes a value. Responsibility stops being enforced and becomes owned. This is precisely why doubt is dangerous to rigid religion. Rigid systems rely on certainty. They rely on clear lines, absolute answers, and unquestioned authority. Doubt blurs those lines. It forces people to think, to weigh consequences, to sit with ambiguity. That process cannot be rushed or controlled. But for mature thinking, doubt is essential. It replaces borrowed beliefs with earned understanding. Instead of repeating conclusions handed down by tradition, people begin forming their own. That requires effort, reflection, and the courage to live without guaranteed answers. Not everyone wants that responsibility. It is easier to follow than to choose, easier to obey than to evaluate, easier to inherit meaning than to create it. Doubt removes those shortcuts and asks something uncomfortable in return. What will you stand for when no one is watching? What will guide you when certainty is gone? What values remain when fear is no longer in charge? For those willing to face those questions, doubt is not a loss of meaning. It is the beginning of one that is truly their own. The real reason doubt is feared. So, let us say it plainly, without soft language or polite distance. Religious systems do not fear doubt because it leads people into sin. They fear doubt because it leads people out of dependence. It leads to freedom, and freedom is unpredictable. Freedom to think without asking permission first. Freedom to disagree without feeling shame. Freedom to examine ideas instead of inheriting them. Freedom to build meaning from lived experience rather than borrowed authority. That kind of freedom cannot be managed easily. When someone realizes that morality does not collapse without fear, the foundation begins to crack. When they see that compassion does not require threat, surveillance, or eternal consequences, the emotional leverage disappears. When purpose no longer depends on external approval, control weakens. The system loses its grip not because people become worse, but because they become autonomous. Autonomous individuals do not need constant guidance. They do not need rigid rules to behave ethically. They do not need sacred intermediaries to tell them how to think or who they are. They take responsibility for their choices and their values. That is far more dangerous to an institution than any moral failure. Sin can be forgiven because it still accepts the structure. It still acknowledges authority. It still plays by the rules, even when it breaks them. Doubt does not ask for forgiveness because it no longer assumes the judge has the right to judge. Once someone understands that meaning can exist without fear, obedience stops being automatic. Respect must be earned. Authority must justify itself. Traditions must explain their purpose instead of hiding behind age or sanctity. And that kind of questioning spreads quietly, person by person. From the outside, it looks like disobedience. From the inside, it feels like clarity, a lifting of pressure, a sense that life is no longer being lived under threat. That is the one thing rigid systems cannot tolerate. Not sin, not failure, not weakness. Freedom. And that is the one transgression they cannot forgive, because once it appears, it cannot be taken back. Doubt is not the enemy of truth, it is the beginning of it. It is the moment the mind stops repeating and starts examining. Sin can be corrected, obedience can be restored. Belief can be repaired and reinforced again and again. Those processes keep people within familiar boundaries. But doubt changes who you are. It quietly reshapes how you relate to authority, to meaning, and to yourself. It turns followers into thinkers. It turns inherited answers into personal questions. It transforms fear-based faith into conscious choice, or into something entirely new. That is why it is treated as more dangerous than wrongdoing. Doubt does not beg for rescue. It does not ask to be forgiven. It asks to understand. And understanding is irreversible. Once you experience that clarity, comfort loses its grip. Reassurance feels shallow. You start valuing honesty over certainty, depth over repetition, truth over tradition. If this made you question something you were taught, that is not failure. That is growth. That is the mind doing what it was meant to do. And if you value truth over comfort, clarity over tradition, and thinking over fear, stay curious and subscribe.